My daughter-in-law cut my hair in front of all the guests at her wedding. My son just filmed it and laughed. She shouted, "This witch always tries to be the center of attention." I stayed silent. Later that night, I made one phone call, and by morning, they wished they could disappear. I should have known something was wrong when Carmen insisted on doing my hair for her wedding day. "Ruth, darling," she'd said in that syrupy voice she used when she wanted something, "I have this amazing stylist coming to the bridal suite. She could touch up your hair too, make it more appropriate for the photos." I'd been growing my silver hair out for 2 years since my husband Frank passed away. It fell just past my shoulders now, and I liked how it looked. Frank had always said my hair was my crown, even when it started turning gray in my 40s. But Carmen had been making little comments for months about how it aged me, how it looked unkempt, how maybe I should consider a more mature style. The morning of the wedding, I arrived at the country club where Carmen was getting ready. The bridal suite buzzed with activity.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
Carmen's college friends, her sister Monica, and her mother Dolores, all clustered around like birds, each more artificially enhanced than the last. When I walked in wearing my navy dress with the pearl buttons, the room went quiet for just a moment. "Oh, Ruth," Carmen said, looking me up and down. "We definitely need to do something about that hair." I touched my carefully curled silver waves, self-consciously. I'd spent an hour that morning making sure it looked nice. "I think it looks fine, dear." Carmen's smile tightened. "Well, we want everything to be perfect, don't we? Maria here is a miracle worker with older hair." She gestured to a young woman with bright pink streaks who was setting up what looked like a mobile salon station. Something in Carmen's tone made my stomach clench, but I sat down in the chair anyway. In the mirror, I could see the other women watching with expressions I couldn't quite read. Maria began brushing my hair, and I relaxed slightly. Maybe this would be nice after all. "You know what?" Carmen said suddenly, appearing behind me in the mirror. "I think we need to go shorter. Much shorter. Ruth has such a lovely face shape, but all that hair is just overwhelming her features." I started to protest, but Maria was already sectioning my hair, her movements quick and sure. "Wait," I said, trying to turn around, but Carmen's hand was on my shoulder, holding me in place. "Trust me, Ruth. This is my day, and I want everyone to look their absolute best." The first cut took away 6 inches. I watched in horror as my carefully maintained silver waves fell to the floor around the chair. "That's enough," I said, my voice shaking, but Carmen shook her head. "We're not done yet. Monica, what do you think? Doesn't she need more off the sides?" Monica giggled. "Definitely. Very schoolmarm right now." They kept cutting. And cutting. My beautiful hair, the hair that Frank had loved to run his fingers through, the hair that had taken me 2 years to grow out, disappeared in chunks around my feet. When they finally stopped, I looked like I'd been attacked with hedge clippers. The style was harsh, unflattering, adding years to my face. "Much better," Carmen said, though her smile looked more like a smirk. "Very age-appropriate." I stared at my reflection, barely recognizing myself. My eyes filled with tears, but I blinked them back. This was Carmen's wedding day. I wouldn't make a scene. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. I sat in the front row, painfully aware of how ridiculous I must look. Several guests did double takes when they saw me, and I heard whispered comments about my drastic haircut. Through it all, my son James beamed at his bride, completely oblivious to what had just happened to his mother. It was during the reception that things got worse. The photographer was arranging family photos when Carmen suddenly called out, "Oh wait, we need to fix Ruth's hair before pictures. It's sticking up in the back." Before I could react, she was behind me again, her fingers in what remained of my hair. But instead of smoothing it down, she grabbed a handful and yanked hard. I cried out in pain and surprise. "Oops," Carmen said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I think I pulled out some loose pieces. Ruth, your hair is so thin. Maybe we should cut a bit more to even it out." "No," I said firmly, stepping away from her. "Leave it alone." But Carmen was already calling Maria over, the same stylist from the morning. "Just a quick touch-up," Carmen announced to the crowd of guests who had gathered to watch. "We can't have uneven hair in the family photos." I said no, I repeated, but my voice was lost in the murmur of the crowd. James appeared beside his new wife, his phone already out and recording. "Mom, just let her fix it," he said, laughing. "You look like you stuck your finger in an electrical socket." The guests laughed too, a sound that felt like glass breaking in my chest. Maria approached with her scissors, and Carmen grabbed my shoulders, holding me in place. "This witch always tries to be the center of attention," Carmen announced to the crowd, her voice carrying across the reception area. "Even on my wedding day, she has to create drama." The cutting began again, right there in front of 200 guests. I felt each snip like a physical blow, not just to my hair, but to my dignity. People were taking pictures, recording videos. My humiliation was being documented for posterity. "There," Carmen said finally, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Much better, age-appropriate." I touched what remained of my hair. It was shorter than it had been since I was 12 years old, choppy and uneven. I looked like someone who belonged in an institution, not at a family celebration. James lowered his phone, still chuckling. "Sorry, Mom, but Carmen's right. You were looking a little wild there for a minute." I stood frozen in that reception hall, surrounded by laughing strangers, my son's laughter cutting deeper than any scissors could. The woman who had raised him alone after his father died in a car accident when James was 15, who had worked 2 jobs to put him through college, who had given him everything, was nothing more than entertainment at his wedding. "I need some air," I managed to say, my voice barely audible. I walked out of that reception hall on unsteady legs, my hand repeatedly touching the butchered remains of my hair. In the parking lot, I sat in my car for a long time, staring at myself in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at me was a stranger, aged and diminished, but as the shock began to wear off, something else started to build in my chest. Not sadness, though that was there too. Not embarrassment, though I felt plenty of that. It was anger, cold and sharp and utterly unfamiliar. In 68 years, I had never felt anything quite like it. I thought about Carmen's triumphant smile as she held those scissors. I thought about James filming my humiliation for his friends to laugh at later. I thought about 5 years of small cruelties, subtle digs, and calculated diminishments that had led to this moment. Carmen wanted to play games with me. She wanted to treat me like some doddering old fool who could be pushed around and humiliated for sport. What she didn't know was that I had been protecting her for 5 years. I had information that could destroy not just her marriage, but her entire carefully constructed life. As I drove home that night, my ruined hair hidden under a scarf, I made a decision. The time for protection was over. The time for silence was over. Carmen had declared war on me in front of 200 people. Now she was going to learn what happened when you humiliated Ruth Morrison. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 5 years. "Detective Morrison," came the familiar voice. "Hello, Michael," I said to my nephew. "I think it's time we had that conversation about Carmen we should have had years ago." Detective Michael Morrison arrived at my house 20 minutes after I called him. He'd always been a good boy, even as a man pushing 40 with his own family and responsibilities. When he knocked on my door that night, still in his dress uniform from some police function he'd left early, I saw the concern in his eyes as he took in my butchered hair. "Aunt Ruth," he said quietly, stepping into my living room. "Jesus, what did she do to you?" I touched the uneven strands self-consciously. In the harsh bathroom light earlier, the damage had looked even worse than I'd thought. She wanted me to look age-appropriate for her wedding photos. Michael's jaw tightened. He'd never liked Carmen, though he'd been diplomatic about it over the years. "This isn't about a haircut, is it? You said on the phone we needed to talk about something from 5 years ago." I gestured for him to sit down in Frank's old recliner while I settled on the couch. For a moment, I couldn't find the words. What I was about to tell him would shatter James's world, and despite everything that had happened tonight, he was still my son. "Remember when James first brought Carmen home?" I asked finally. "How she seemed to just appear in his life out of nowhere." Michael nodded. "Always thought that was odd. James never mentioned dating anyone. Then suddenly he's head over heels for this woman none of us had ever heard of. That's because she chose him," I said, very carefully. I stood up and walked to the bookshelf where I'd hidden a manila envelope for 5 years. My hands shook slightly as I pulled it out. Inside were photographs, printed emails, and documents I'd hoped I'd never have to use. "Before Carmen ever met James," I began, spreading the contents across my coffee table, "she was working as a high-end escort in the city." Michael leaned forward, his expression shifting from concern to professional interest. "You're sure about this?" I handed him a photograph taken outside an upscale hotel. Carmen, looking exactly as she did now, walking arm in arm with a man old enough to be her grandfather. The timestamp showed it was taken 3 months before she supposedly met James at that coffee shop. "I hired a private investigator when they got engaged," I admitted. "Something about her didn't sit right with me." She had no past, no real friends, no family stories that held up under scrutiny. When someone seems too perfect, there's usually a reason. Michael studied the photograph, then looked at the accompanying report. Scarlett Devine. That was her working name. I nodded. She specialized in older men, wealthy widowers primarily. The investigator found she'd had relationships with at least 6 different men over a 3-year period. Always the same pattern. She'd research them first, learn about their families, their interests, their vulnerabilities. And you've known this for 5 years? Michael's voice carried a note of disbelief. Aunt Ruth, why didn't you tell James? I sank back onto the couch, feeling every one of my 68 years. Because he loved her. Because when I saw how happy she made him, I hoped maybe she'd changed. Maybe she'd found something real with him and left that life behind. The truth was more complicated than that. But I wasn't ready to share all of it yet. I'd kept silent, because I'd been afraid of being seen as the jealous mother-in-law who couldn't accept her son's happiness. I'd been afraid of losing James completely if I tried to destroy his relationship with unfounded accusations. So you just watched, Michael said, not unkindly. I watched, and I hoped I was wrong. For 5 years, I convinced myself that maybe Carmen really had changed. Maybe she really loved James. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Michael picked up another photograph. This one showing Carmen entering an apartment building I didn't recognize. When was this taken? I looked at the timestamp. 2 months ago. His eyebrows rose. She's still working? The investigator wasn't certain, but she's been visiting that building regularly, always during the day when James is at work. Always dressed differently than how she dresses at home. More... I searched for the right word. Professional. Michael was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents. Aunt Ruth, if even half of this is true, we need to tell James immediately. Do we? I asked. Tonight at the reception, he filmed his own mother being humiliated for entertainment. He laughed while his wife destroyed something that was important to me. Would he believe me if I told him his perfect wife is a lie? The question hung in the air between us. We both knew the answer. James was so completely under Carmen's influence that he'd dismiss any accusation against her as jealousy or senility on my part. There's more, I said, pulling out a folder I'd labeled financial records. Carmen has been systematically isolating James from his friends, his co-workers, even from me. She's convinced him to quit his job at the engineering firm and start his own consulting business. Michael frowned. That doesn't sound necessarily bad. It is when she's the only one with access to the business accounts. James thinks they're building something together, but Carmen has positioned herself to control every dollar that comes in or goes out. I showed him bank statements I'd obtained through means I preferred not to discuss. James's name was on the accounts, but Carmen was listed as the primary contact for everything. She received all the statements, had online access, and could make transfers without his signature. She's been moving money around, I continued, small amounts at first, but it's accelerating. James thinks business is slow, but Carmen is siphoning off payments before he ever sees them. Michael whistled low. This is comprehensive. She's been planning this for years. 5 years of patient manipulation. She studied him, learned his weaknesses, figured out exactly how to make him dependent on her. And it worked perfectly until tonight. What changed tonight? I touched my ruined hair again. Tonight, she made it personal. All these years, I've been the polite mother-in-law. I bit my tongue when she redecorated James's house and threw out all of Frank's things that were stored there. I smiled when she convinced James to skip family holidays because they conflicted with her social schedule. I stayed quiet when she started calling me by my first name instead of Mom, even though James had asked her to use Mom after Frank died. My voice was getting stronger as I spoke, the anger that had been building all evening finally finding words. I protected her because I thought she made James happy. I kept her secrets because I didn't want to be the bitter old woman who couldn't accept her son's choice. But tonight, she humiliated me in front of 200 people for sport. She wanted to show everyone that I was nothing, that I could be treated however she pleased. Michael leaned back in Frank's chair, processing everything I'd told him. What do you want to do with this information? For the first time all evening, I smiled. Not a polite, accommodating smile, but something sharper. Something with teeth. I want to give Carmen exactly what she's given me for 5 years. I want to show her what it feels like to have someone smile at you while they destroy everything you care about. I want her to understand that some people are quiet not because they're weak, but because they're choosing to be kind. I gathered up the photographs and documents, organizing them back into neat piles. And I want her to learn that when kind people stop being kind, they can be absolutely devastating. Michael was watching me with something that might have been respect. This isn't just about revenge, is it? No, I said quietly. It's about protecting James. Carmen isn't done with him yet. She's been laying groundwork for something bigger. And when she's ready to move on to her next victim, she'll leave him with nothing. No money, no friends, no family, no support system. I've seen this pattern before in the investigator's reports on her previous relationships. I pulled out one final document, one I'd been saving for last. Carmen's real name is Maria Santos. She's originally from Phoenix, and she has a daughter she abandoned when the girl was 8 years old. Michael's eyes widened. James doesn't know about the daughter? James doesn't know about any of it. Carmen has been playing a character for 5 years, and she's very good at it. But characters have weaknesses, Michael. And I know all of hers. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street where I'd lived for 30 years. Tomorrow, Carmen will wake up thinking she won something tonight. She'll think she successfully put me in my place, showed me who has the real power in this family. I turned back to Michael, feeling more certain than I had in years. She has no idea that the woman she humiliated tonight has been watching her every move for 5 years. She has no idea that I know about the apartment she rents under her real name, about the clients she still sees, about the money she's been stealing from my son. Michael gathered up the documents. What's your timeline? Slow and careful. Carmen thinks I'm a harmless old woman who can be pushed around. I want to keep her thinking that while I prepare everything perfectly. I paused, remembering the feeling of those scissors cutting through my hair, the sound of James's laughter. She wanted to destroy me tonight, Michael. Now I'm going to return the favor. And James? That was the hardest part. My son, my only child, had chosen his wife over his mother tonight. He'd filmed my humiliation and laughed at my pain. Part of me wanted to hurt him too, to make him pay for that betrayal. But James was also Carmen's victim. Even if he couldn't see it yet, she'd isolated him, manipulated him, turned him against his own family. When the truth came out, he'd be devastated. James will have to make his own choices, I said finally. When he learns who Carmen really is, he'll have to decide what kind of man he wants to be. Whether he chooses to make amends with me or not, at least he'll be free of her. After Michael left, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by 5 years' worth of evidence of Carmen's deception. Tomorrow, I would begin the careful process of dismantling her life the same way she'd been dismantling mine. But tonight, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. Not just the haircut, but everything that had led to this moment. 5 years of small humiliations, of being gradually erased from my own son's life, of watching a stranger wear my daughter-in-law's face while systematically destroying everything I held dear. Carmen thought she'd won tonight. She thought she'd finally broken me. Tomorrow, she'd learn how wrong she was. The morning after the wedding, I stared at myself in the bathroom mirror and made a decision. The harsh fluorescent light showed every angle of Carmen's handiwork, every uneven cut, every deliberate choice to make me look as old and foolish as possible. But instead of despair, I felt something cold and calculating settling into my chest. I called my hairdresser, Sandra, who I'd been seeing for 15 years. When she opened her salon door and saw me, her face went white. "Oh, honey," she breathed, reaching out to touch what remained of my hair. "What happened to you?" "My daughter-in-law happened," I said simply. "Can you fix it?" Sandra walked around me slowly, assessing the damage like a surgeon examining a patient. "I can work with this, but it'll have to be very short. Pixie cut short. Is that okay?" An hour later, I looked at myself in Sandra's mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. The pixie cut was elegant, sophisticated, years younger than the matronly style Carmen had butchered me into. But more than that, it looked intentional, confident. "You know what?" Sandra said, stepping back to admire her work. "This suits you better than the long hair ever did. You look fierce." Fierce. I liked that word. My next stop was the public library. I'd always been comfortable with computers, but what I needed to research required more privacy than my home internet could provide. I found a quiet corner terminal and began searching for Maria Santos, Carmen's real name. The deeper I dug, the more disturbed I became. Carmen hadn't just been an escort. She'd been part of a sophisticated operation that targeted lonely widowers and divorcees. The women involved would research their marks extensively, sometimes for months, before engineering chance meetings. I found forum posts where men complained about women who'd disappeared suddenly after gaining access to their bank accounts or convincing them to make substantial loans. The descriptions matched Carmen perfectly. down to her habit of redecorating their homes and isolating them from friends and family. But it was a news article from Phoenix that made my blood run cold. Local woman seeks information on missing mother. The article was 2 years old, featuring a young woman named Maria Santos searching for her mother, Maria, who had abandoned her when she was 8. I stared at the photograph of Isabella for a long time. She had Carmen's eyes, Carmen's smile. But there was a sadness in her face that spoke of years of abandonment and unanswered questions. Carmen had a daughter she'd thrown away like garbage when continuing her lifestyle became more important than being a mother. I printed everything and drove home, my mind working furiously. Carmen thought she was so clever, so untouchable in her perfect new life with James. But every lie has cracks, and I was about to find all of hers. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in 5 years. I drove to James's house. The sprawling suburban home had been Frank's pride and joy before he died. He'd left it to James in his will, along with a substantial life insurance policy. In the early days of their relationship, Carmen had been so grateful for my generosity in letting them live there rent-free while James established his business. What she didn't know was that Frank had been far more suspicious of her than I'd ever admitted. The house was still technically in a trust that I controlled, though I'd never mentioned that detail to anyone. Carmen answered the door in yoga clothes, her hair perfect despite supposedly being home all day. When she saw me, her face shifted into that practiced smile I'd grown to despise. "Ruth, what a lovely surprise. I was just thinking about you." Her eyes moved to my new haircut, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker across her features. Surprise? Maybe even concern. "Your hair looks different. Sandra fixed what you did yesterday," I said pleasantly. "May I come in?" She stepped aside reluctantly. "Of course. James isn't home yet, but I'm sure he'll be back soon." I followed her into the living room, noting how she'd continued to erase Frank's presence from the house. The last of his photographs had been removed, replaced with generic art that looked expensive but soulless. "I wanted to thank you," I said, settling into what used to be Frank's favorite chair. Carmen blinked, clearly thrown off script. "Thank me? For the haircut? For showing me exactly who you are in front of all those people?" I smiled, keeping my voice light and conversational. It was very illuminating. Something shifted in Carmen's expression. The mask of sweetness slipped just slightly, revealing something harder underneath. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Of course you don't," I said, still smiling. "Just like you don't mean anything by the way you've been redecorating this house, throwing out Frank's things, convincing James to distance himself from his old friends. All perfectly innocent." Carmen sat down across from me, her posture suddenly more alert. "Ruth, I think there might be some misunderstanding between us." "Oh, I don't think so. I think we understand each other perfectly now." I leaned forward slightly. "You see, Carmen, I've been quiet all these years because I was trying to be kind. I was trying to give you the benefit of the doubt, to believe that you really loved my son." "I do love James," she said quickly. "Do you? Or do you love what he represents? The security? The respectability? The clean slate he gave you when you needed to reinvent yourself?" Carmen's face went very still. "I don't know what you're talking about." I opened my purse and pulled out one of the photographs, setting it on the coffee table between us, the one of her outside the hotel with the elderly man. Carmen's face went white. She stared at the photograph for a long moment, then looked back at me with something approaching respect in her eyes. "You've been investigating me," she said finally. "I've been protecting you," I corrected. "For 5 years, I've known exactly who you are and what you were before you met James. I kept your secrets because I hoped you'd grown beyond them." Carmen reached for the photograph, but I was faster, slipping it back into my purse. "How much do you know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything. Your real name, your daughter in Phoenix, your current apartment in the city, your recent activities. Everything." Carmen stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. When she turned back, the sweet daughter-in-law act was completely gone. In its place was someone harder, more calculating. "What do you want?" she asked bluntly. "I want you to remember that I chose to protect you when I could have destroyed you. I want you to think about that the next time you decide to humiliate me in public." Carmen laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think this gives you power over me? You think I'm going to be nice to you now because you have some old photographs? I think you're going to be very careful about how you treat me from now on," I said, standing to leave. "Because those photographs are just the beginning of what I have." I walked toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Carmen, the next time you cut someone's hair, you might want to make sure they don't have documentation of every financial transaction you've made in the past 5 years. I left her standing in that living room, her face frozen between shock and fury. On the drive home, I allowed myself a small smile. The game was officially in motion. That evening, I made my second phone call, this one to a number in Phoenix that I'd found in Isabella Santos's social media profile. "Hello?" The voice was young, tentative. "Is this Isabella Santos?" "Yes. Who's this?" I took a deep breath. "My name is Ruth Morrison. I believe I have information about your mother." The silence that followed was heavy with years of hope and disappointment. When Isabella finally spoke again, her voice was shaking. "What kind of information?" "The kind that might help you find her," I said gently. "She's been living under the name Carmen Morrison for the past 5 years. She married my son." Isabella's gasp was audible even over the phone. She's married? She has a family?" The pain in that young woman's voice broke my heart. Here was another of Carmen's victims. A daughter abandoned so her mother could pursue a lifestyle that didn't include the inconvenience of children. "Isabella, I need you to know that my son doesn't know about you. Your mother has been lying to him about her past." "Of course she has," Isabella said bitterly. "That's what she does. She lies, she takes what she wants, and she disappears when things get complicated." "Not this time," I said firmly. "This time she's going to face the consequences of her choices." "What are you asking me to do?" I'd thought about this carefully. Isabella didn't deserve to be used as a weapon in my war with Carmen, but she also deserved to know that her mother was alive and well, building a new life while her daughter spent years wondering if she was dead. "I'm asking if you'd like to meet your half-brother," I said finally. "James doesn't know you exist, but he has a right to know he has a sister. And you have a right to be part of the family your mother tried to erase." Isabella was quiet for a long moment. "She really just replaced me? Started over like I never existed?" "Yes," I said, not softening the truth. "But that doesn't mean you have to stay erased. If you're willing, I think it's time James learned who his wife really is." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen making lists. Carmen had played a long game, 5 years of careful manipulation and planning. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated the woman she was targeting. Ruth Morrison might look like a harmless grandmother, but I'd raised a son alone after losing my husband to cancer when James was 15. I'd built a successful real estate business from nothing, worked 16-hour days to keep us afloat, and navigated the male-dominated business world of the 1990s with nothing but determination and steel. Carmen wanted to play games with me? She'd just challenged someone who'd been playing a much harder game for much longer. I pulled out my calendar and began planning. Isabella would need time to arrange travel from Phoenix. Michael would need time to verify some of the information and possibly gather additional evidence. And I would need time to set the stage perfectly. Carmen liked dramatic gestures, public humiliations, moments where she could demonstrate her power over others. Well, I was about to give her the most dramatic moment of her life. But unlike last night's spontaneous cruelty, my revelation would be carefully orchestrated, precisely timed, and absolutely devastating. Carmen had taught me that family dinners could be battlefields. Now I was going to teach her that some battles are won before they're even fought. Isabella Santos arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after our phone conversation. I watched from my kitchen window as the taxi pulled into my driveway, my heart pounding with anticipation and dread. This young woman was about to meet the brother she'd never known existed, and learn that her mother had built an entire life while pretending she'd never had a daughter. When Isabella stepped out of the taxi, I saw Carmen immediately in her features. The same dark eyes, the same graceful way of moving, but where Carmen's beauty felt calculated and cold, Isabella's was warm and genuine. She looked nervous, clutching a small overnight bag and glancing around my neighborhood like she wasn't sure she belonged. I opened the front door before she could knock. "Isabella?" She nodded, offering a tentative smile that broke my heart. "Mrs. Morrison, thank you for reaching out to me." "Call me Ruth, honey. Come in." As I led her to the living room, I noticed how she took in every detail of my home. The family photos on the mantel, the comfortable furniture that spoke of decades of family life, the warmth that came from a house filled with love rather than artifice. "This is what a real home looks like," she said quietly, settling onto my couch. "I always wondered." I poured us both coffee, studying this young woman who represented both my weapon against Carmen and an innocent victim caught in our war. At 23, Isabella had Carmen's beauty, but none of her hardness. There was something open and honest about her that made me understand why Carmen had abandoned her. Genuine emotion would have been inconvenient for the life Carmen wanted to live. Tell me about James, Isabella said. My brother. The words seemed to stick in her throat. I pulled out a photo album I'd prepared, filled with pictures of James from childhood through adulthood. Isabella studied each one with hungry intensity, drinking in the sight of the family she'd been denied. He was a sweet child, I said, sitting beside her, always trying to fix things, bring home stray animals, defend the underdog. Even as an adult, he sees the best in people. That's how she trapped him, Isabella said, not looking up from a photo of James graduating from college. She's good at finding people who want to believe in her. Tell me about when she left. Isabella's hands stilled on the photo. I was 8. I came home from school and found a note on the kitchen table. It said she had to go away for work and that my grandmother would take care of me. But Grandma had been dead for 2 years. My chest tightened. What did you do? I waited. For 3 days I waited in that apartment for her to come back. When the neighbors finally called social services, I still believed she was coming back. Even when they placed me in foster care, I thought it was temporary. The casual cruelty of it staggered me. Carmen had simply walked away from her own child like she was discarding an unwanted possession. Did you ever try to find her? Isabella nodded. For years, every birthday, every Christmas, every time I was moved to a new foster home, I hired investigators when I turned 18 and got access to my trust fund. That's how I found out she'd been using different names. Different identities. Trust fund? My father left me money when he died. Mom never knew about it because she'd already left him by then. He set it up so I'd get access when I turned 18. Isabella's smile was bitter. Ironic, isn't it? The daughter she abandoned ended up with more money than she probably made in all those years of working. This was information I could use. Isabella wasn't just Carmen's abandoned daughter. She was her abandoned, financially independent daughter. That changed the dynamic considerably. Isabella, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Are you willing to meet James? To let him know you exist? She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photos spread between us. Will it hurt him? Learning about me, about what our mother really is? I thought about my son, about the man Carmen had systematically isolated and manipulated. Yes, it will hurt him. But Isabella, she's going to hurt him anyway. She's been positioning herself to take everything and disappear, just like she did to you. At least this way, he'll have family left when she's gone. And her? What happens to her when James finds out? That depends on James, I said carefully. But consequences, real consequences, are long overdue. Isabella closed the photo album and looked directly at me. She destroyed my childhood. She made me spend 15 years wondering if I was so terrible that my own mother couldn't love me. If exposing her saves James from the same kind of damage, then yes, I'm willing. That evening, I called James. Mom? He sounded surprised. We hadn't spoken since the wedding, and I could hear wariness in his voice. How are you feeling? Much better, thank you. I was calling to invite you and Carmen for dinner this Saturday. There's someone I'd like you both to meet. Someone? A young woman I've become friends with recently. Isabella. She's new to the area and doesn't know many people. I thought it would be nice to introduce her to the family. There was a pause, and I could almost hear him processing this unexpected invitation. After years of Carmen discouraging family gatherings, a social dinner was unusual. That's nice of you, Mom. Let me check with Carmen about Saturday. Of course he had to check with Carmen. My 60-year-old son couldn't accept a dinner invitation without his wife's permission. Wonderful. 6 o'clock. Nothing fancy, just a casual family dinner. After I hung up, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. The pieces were falling into place exactly as I'd planned. Carmen would come to dinner expecting to meet some lonely old woman I'd befriended. Instead, she'd come face to face with the daughter she'd abandoned and the life she'd been trying to escape. Friday afternoon, Carmen called. Ruth, about tomorrow night. Her voice carried that edge of control she used when she was trying to manage a situation. James mentioned you're having someone over? Yes, a lovely young woman named Isabella. I think you'll find her very interesting. Where did you meet her? I smiled at the barely concealed suspicion in her voice. Through a mutual acquaintance. She's originally from Phoenix, actually. Such a small world. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Carmen was smart enough to recognize a threat, even if she couldn't identify it yet. Phoenix, she repeated carefully. How nice. Well, we're looking forward to meeting her. I'm sure you are, I said. See you at 6. Saturday morning, I spent extra time preparing. Not just the meal, but myself. I chose a navy dress that made me look distinguished rather than dowdy, styled my new pixie cut carefully, and applied makeup with a steady hand. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who meant business. Isabella arrived early as we'd planned. She looked beautiful in a simple green dress that complemented her dark coloring, but I could see the nervousness in her eyes. "Are you ready for this?" I asked, squeezing her hand. "As ready as I'll ever be. How do you think James will react?" "James is going to be shocked, confused, and probably angry, but once he understands the full scope of what Carmen has been hiding from him, I think he'll be grateful to know he has a sister." "And Carmen?" I thought about the woman who had spent 5 years systematically erasing me from my son's life, who had culminated her campaign by publicly humiliating me at her own wedding. Carmen is going to realize that some secrets are too big to stay buried forever. At exactly 6 o'clock, James and Carmen arrived. Through the window, I watched them walk up my front path, James carrying a bottle of wine, Carmen scanning my house like she was assessing it for weaknesses. She'd dressed carefully, too, in an expensive dress that screamed success and sophistication. When I opened the door, James hugged me briefly, and I caught him studying my new haircut with what might have been approval. "Mom, you look great. The shorter hair really suits you." Carmen's smile was sharp as glass. "Very age-appropriate," she said, and I heard the deliberate echo of her words from the wedding. "Come in," I said pleasantly. "I want you to meet Isabella." Isabella rose from the couch as we entered the living room, and I watched James's face carefully. There was immediate curiosity there, the natural reaction to meeting someone new. But there was something else, too. Something that made him pause and really look at her. "James, Carmen, this is Isabella Santos." "Isabella, this is my son James and his wife Carmen." The moment Carmen heard the name Santos, I saw the blood drain from her face. She recovered quickly, stepping forward with her hand extended, but I caught the slight tremor in her voice when she spoke. "Isabella, what a lovely name. Santos, that's Spanish, isn't it?" "Yes," Isabella replied, shaking Carmen's hand and looking directly into her eyes. "It's my father's name. My mother's name, too, before she started using other identities." The words hung in the air like smoke. James looked confused, glancing between Isabella and Carmen as if trying to solve a puzzle. Carmen's smile had frozen on her face. "Other identities?" James asked. "What do you mean?" Isabella looked at me, and I nodded encouragement. This was the moment we'd planned for, the moment when Carmen's carefully constructed world would begin to crumble. "I mean," Isabella said, never taking her eyes off Carmen, "my mother abandoned me when I was 8 years old. She's been using different names and identities ever since, moving from man to man, family to family, always running from the consequences of her choices." James's face went white. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. What does this have to do with us?" Isabella reached into her purse and pulled out an old photograph, one I'd seen during our phone conversations. It showed a younger Carmen holding a little girl with dark hair and sad eyes. "This is me and my mother 15 years ago," Isabella said, handing the photo to James. "Before she decided that being a mother was too inconvenient for the life she wanted to live." James stared at the photograph, his hands beginning to shake. In the picture, Carmen looked exactly as she did now, barely changed by the passing years. There was no denying the resemblance between the woman in the photo and his wife. "Carmen," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who is this?" Carmen's mask finally slipped completely. The sweet, innocent act she'd maintained for 5 years crumbled, revealing something desperate and trapped underneath. "James, I can explain," she started, but her voice cracked on the words. "Explain what?" he demanded, standing up so quickly his chair nearly toppled. "Explain why there's a woman in my mother's living room claiming to be your daughter? Explain why you never mentioned having a child?" Carmen looked around the room like a cornered animal, her gaze finally landing on me. In her eyes, I saw recognition of what I'd done, appreciation for the elegance of the trap I'd set. "You planned this," she said to me, her voice flat with defeat. "I planned a family dinner," I replied pleasantly. "I thought it was time James met his sister." The word hit James like a physical blow. He sank back into his chair, still clutching the photograph, staring at Isabella with new understanding. "My sister," he repeated numbly. "You're my sister," Isabella nodded, tears beginning to fall. "I've been looking for her my whole life. I just never imagined I'd find her married to my brother." The silence in my living room stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. James sat frozen, clutching the photograph of Carmen and Isabella, his face cycling through emotions I recognized from his childhood when he was trying to process something too big for his understanding. Carmen stood by the window, her back to us, her shoulders rigid with trapped fury. Isabella remained on the couch, tears streaming down her face as she watched her brother grapple with the reality of her existence. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I used to imagine what it would be like to meet you," she said to James. "I created stories about the brother I might have somewhere. I just never thought I'd find you married to the woman who abandoned me." James looked up from the photograph, his eyes red-rimmed and confused. "How long have you known about me?" "I found out 3 weeks ago when Mrs. Morrison contacted me. Before that, I didn't even know Mom had remarried. She's very good at disappearing completely." Carmen whirled around from the window, her composure finally shattering. "You have no right," she snarled at me. "No right to bring her here, to destroy my family with lies from the past." "Lies?" Isabella stood up, her voice growing stronger. "Is it a lie that you left me alone for 3 days when I was 8 years old? Is it a lie that I spent 10 years in foster care because you decided being a mother was too inconvenient? You don't understand," Carmen said desperately, turning to James. "I was young, I was scared, I made mistakes, but that was a lifetime ago. I'm not that person anymore." James was staring at his wife like he'd never seen her before. "You have a daughter. You've had a daughter this whole time and you never told me." "It's complicated," Carmen began, but James cut her off. "Complicated? Having a child is complicated?" His voice was rising, years of suppressed doubt finally finding expression. "What else haven't you told me, Carmen? What other parts of your life have you been lying about?" Carmen's eyes darted to me, and I saw her calculating, trying to figure out how much I really knew. "Ruth has been filling your head with poison. She's jealous because she can't accept that you chose me over her." "I chose you over her?" James repeated the words like they tasted bitter. "When did I ever have to choose? Every time she tried to interfere in our marriage. Every time she questioned my decisions. Every time she made me feel like an outsider in my own family." I almost laughed at the irony. Carmen, who had systematically isolated James from everyone who cared about him, was claiming to be the victim of interference. "James," I said quietly, "there are some things you need to know about Carmen's career before she met you." Carmen went very still. "Ruth, don't." "Don't what?" James demanded. "Don't tell me more truth? Don't help me understand who I actually married?" I walked to my desk and pulled out the folder I'd prepared. Inside were copies of everything Michael and I had compiled over the past 3 weeks. Not just the escort photographs, but financial records showing money transfers from multiple older men, apartment leases under different names, and most damning of all, recent surveillance photos showing Carmen entering and leaving the city apartment she still maintained. "Your wife," I said, spreading the documents across the coffee table, "has been living a double life for the entire duration of your marriage." James picked up the first photograph, his face going pale as he recognized Carmen outside the upscale hotel. "What is this?" "Evidence that Carmen was working as a high-end escort when she met you. Evidence that she researched you for months before engineering your first meeting. Evidence that she's never actually stopped." Carmen lunged forward, trying to gather up the papers, but Michael appeared in the doorway. I'd asked him to wait outside until this moment, to let the family confrontation play out before adding the weight of legal authority. "I wouldn't touch those if I were you, Carmen," he said, his detective's badge visible on his belt. "They're evidence in an ongoing investigation." Carmen spun around, trapped now between her abandoned daughter, her deceived husband, her betrayed mother-in-law, and a police detective. For the first time in 5 years, she had nowhere to run. "Investigation into what?" James asked, his voice hollow. Michael stepped into the room, his expression professionally neutral. "Fraud, identity theft, and potentially accessory to elder abuse. We've been tracking a network of women who target vulnerable men, particularly widowers with substantial assets." I watched Carmen's face as the full scope of her situation became clear. She wasn't just facing exposure in her marriage, she was facing criminal charges. "You set me up," she said to me, her voice thick with hatred. "All of this, the dinner, bringing her here, it's all revenge for the wedding." "No," I said calmly. "This is justice for Isabella, who spent 15 years wondering why her own mother didn't love her enough to stay. This is protection for James, who deserves to know who he really married before you finish destroying his life." James was flipping through the documents, his breathing shallow and fast. "These bank transfers. Carmen, these are from our business accounts. You've been stealing from our clients?" "Not stealing," Carmen said quickly. "Those were fees for consulting services." "What consulting services?" Michael asked, pulling out a notebook. "Because according to our investigation, you've never filed tax returns for any independent income. All of this money has been going into accounts under your real name. Accounts your husband doesn't know about." Carmen's carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. I could see her mind racing, trying to find an angle, an escape, a way to manipulate her way out of this like she had so many times before. "James," she said, turning to him with tears that looked almost genuine. "Please, you have to believe me. I love you. Everything I did was to protect us, to build our life together." James set down the papers and looked at his wife. Really looked at her, for what I suspected was the first time in years. "Protect us from what? From the truth? From your own daughter?" "She's not part of our family," Carmen said desperately. "She's from my past. From before I met you. She doesn't belong here." Isabella made a sound like she'd been slapped. "I'm your daughter, your blood. But this stranger matters more to you than I ever did. You're not a child anymore," Carmen snapped, her mask slipping further. "You're 23 years old. You don't need a mother now." "I needed one when I was 8. Isabella shot back. "I needed one when I was 10 and crying myself to sleep every night wondering what I'd done wrong. I needed one when I was 16 and had no one to call when I was scared or hurt or lost." James was staring at Carmen like he'd never seen her before. "You left an 8-year-old alone for 3 days?" "I was coming back," Carmen said. But even she didn't sound convinced. "No, you weren't," Isabella said firmly. "You packed everything that mattered to you. Your jewelry, your clothes, even the photograph of your parents. You left me a note and $10 for food. $10 for a child you were supposed to love." The brutality of it seemed to hit James like a physical blow. He doubled over slightly, pressing his hands to his face. "I don't know you," he said to Carmen, his voice muffled. "I don't know who you are at all." Carmen made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "James, listen to me. Your mother has been planning this for weeks. She's manipulating you, using this girl to turn you against me. Can't you see what she's doing?" James raised his head and looked at me, and for a moment I thought Carmen might actually succeed in deflecting blame onto me. But then he spoke, and his words cut deeper than any scissors ever could. "What I see is that my mother has been protecting me from the truth about who I married. What I see is that she knew you had a daughter and kept your secret for 5 years. What I see is that she gave you chances to be honest that you never took." He stood up slowly, like an old man, though he was only 35. "And what I see is that when you finally pushed her too far, when you humiliated her at our wedding for sport, she decided to stop protecting you." Carmen's face went through a series of expressions: shock, rage, calculation, and finally, something that looked almost like admiration. "You played me," she said to me. "For 5 years you let me think I was in control while you gathered evidence. You let me think you were weak. I let you think what you needed to think," I replied. "Just like you let James think what he needed to think." Michael stepped forward with a pair of handcuffs. "Carmen Morrison, also known as Maria Santos, also known as Scarlet Divine, you're under arrest for fraud and identity theft. You have the right to remain silent." As Michael read Carmen her rights, she kept her eyes locked on mine. There was no fear there now, no desperation, just cold acknowledgement that she'd been outplayed by someone she'd underestimated. "This isn't over," she said, as Michael guided her toward the door. "Yes," I said quietly, "it is." After they left, James and Isabella sat in my living room in stunned silence. My son looked like he'd aged a decade in the past hour, while Isabella seemed lighter somehow, as if a weight she'd carried for 15 years had finally been lifted. "I don't know what to say," James said finally. "To either of you. Isabella, I'm sorry you went through what you did. And Mom?" He looked at me with something I hadn't seen in years: respect. "I'm sorry I didn't see what was happening. I'm sorry I let her treat you the way she did. You were manipulated by an expert," I said gently. "Carmen has been doing this for years. You're not the first good man she's fooled." Isabella reached over and took James's hand. "We're family," she said simply. "Real family. We don't have to lose each other because of what she did." James squeezed her hand, tears flowing freely now. "I have a sister. After all these years of feeling alone, I have a sister." "You have a family," I corrected, looking at both of them. "We all do." As the evening wound down and we began to process what had happened, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: Not satisfaction exactly, though there was some of that. Not revenge, though Carmen had certainly gotten what she deserved. I felt peace. For the first time in 5 years. I was sitting in my living room with my son, and he was really seeing me, really listening to me. The woman who had tried to erase me from his life was gone, and in her place was the family she'd tried to destroy. Carmen had wanted to teach me about knowing my place. Instead, she'd learned that my place was exactly where I'd always been, at the center of my family, protecting the people I loved from anyone who would hurt them, even when that someone was wearing a wedding dress and holding a pair of scissors. 6 months after Carmen's arrest, I stood in my kitchen making Sunday dinner for a family that had been broken and rebuilt in ways I never could have imagined. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dining room table set for four, because Isabella had moved to town permanently and bought a small house just 10 minutes away. 4, because my family had grown in the most unexpected way. The sound of laughter drifted in from the backyard, where James was teaching Isabella how to use the grill that had been gathering dust since Frank died. Through the window, I watched my son and daughter, because that's what she was now, my daughter in every way that mattered, working together with the easy familiarity of siblings who were making up for lost time. Isabella had Frank's methodical approach to everything, carefully reading the grill manual, while James gestured enthusiastically about the proper way to flip burgers. Watching them together, you'd never know they'd only known each other existed for 6 months. They shared the same laugh, the same way of tilting their heads when they were concentrating, the same stubborn streak that had served them both well in rebuilding their lives. The past 6 months hadn't been easy. Carmen's trial had been a media circus that exposed not just her crimes against James and his clients, but her involvement in a larger network of women who targeted vulnerable men. The prosecutor called it the most sophisticated romance scam operation they'd ever uncovered, spanning multiple states and dozens of victims. Carmen had pled guilty to avoid a longer sentence, but even with her cooperation, she'd received 5 years in federal prison, 5 years to think about the daughter she'd abandoned and the family she'd tried to destroy. James had struggled with the revelation of who his wife really was. The man who prided himself on being a good judge of character had been completely fooled for 5 years. He'd gone through phases of denial, anger, and deep depression as he processed not just Carmen's betrayal, but his own complicity in how she'd treated me. "I filmed her cutting your hair," he'd said to me one evening about 2 months after the arrest, his voice thick with shame. "I actually filmed my own mother being humiliated and thought it was funny." "You were manipulated," I'd told him, as I had many times. Carmen was an expert at making people see what she wanted them to see. "But I should have protected you. I should have stood up for you." The guilt was eating him alive, and I recognized the signs. James had always been prone to taking on responsibility for things beyond his control, even as a child. It was part of what had made him vulnerable to Carmen's manipulation in the first place. "You're protecting me now," I'd said. "That's what matters." And he was. James had thrown himself into rebuilding our relationship with the same intensity he brought to everything else. He called every day, visited twice a week, and insisted on handling all my household repairs and maintenance. It was sweet, but sometimes overwhelming. Isabella had been my anchor during those difficult months. While James wrestled with guilt and anger, she focused on the future. She'd used her trust fund to start a nonprofit organization that helped children who'd aged out of foster care, turning her painful experience into something that could help others. "I can't change what happened to me," she told me one afternoon as we planned the organization's launch, "but I can make sure other kids don't fall through the cracks the way I did." Watching her transform her trauma into purpose had been one of the most beautiful things I'd ever witnessed. Isabella had every right to be bitter, angry, and broken. Instead, she chose to be strong, compassionate, and determined to make the world better. She was nothing like her mother. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Through the front window, I saw a familiar car in the driveway. My stomach clenched as I recognized Detective Morrison's unmarked sedan. Michael stood on my porch, still in his work clothes, his expression serious. "Aunt Ruth, do you have a minute?" "Of course, come in." James and Isabella looked up from the grill as we walked through the backyard to the patio. "Uncle Mike," James called out, using the childhood nickname he'd reverted to since Carmen's arrest. "Perfect timing. We're just about to eat." Michael shook his head. "I can't stay long. I just wanted to update you all on something that came up today." We gathered around the patio table, the comfortable family atmosphere suddenly tense with anticipation. Michael pulled out a folder I recognized from months of case preparation. "Carmen wants to see you," he said to Isabella. "All of you, actually. She's requesting a family meeting before her sentencing next week. Isabella's face went pale. Why? She claims she wants to apologize, make amends. Her lawyer thinks it might help with sentencing if she shows genuine remorse and takes responsibility for the damage she's caused. James laughed bitterly. Remorse? She's never shown genuine remorse for anything in her life. This is just another manipulation. Probably, Michael agreed, but the decision is yours. You don't have to see her if you don't want to. I studied Isabella's face, seeing the conflict there. Despite everything Carmen had done, Isabella still carried the hope that most abandoned children never fully lose. The hope that someday, somehow, their parent might explain why they weren't worth staying for. What do you think? Isabella asked me quietly. I considered the question carefully. Carmen had spent 5 years teaching me about the power of calculated cruelty. Maybe it was time for her to learn about the power of calculated mercy. I think, I said slowly, that you should hear what she has to say, not because she deserves your forgiveness, but because you deserve to close this chapter on your own terms. 3 days later, we sat in a sterile meeting room at the county jail. Carmen entered wearing an orange jumpsuit that made her look smaller, more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. Her hair had grown out from its wedding style, and without professional makeup, she looked older, more worn. She sat across from us, her hands folded on the table, and for a long moment, nobody spoke. When she finally raised her eyes to look at Isabella, I saw something I'd never seen before in Carmen's face. Genuine emotion. You look so much like your father, she said softly. Isabella's composure cracked slightly. You remember what he looked like. I remember everything about him. About you. About the life I walked away from. Carmen's voice was barely above a whisper. I told myself for years that I did it for you, that you'd be better off without me, but that was a lie. I did it because I was selfish and scared, and I wanted things more than I wanted to be your mother. James shifted beside me, his anger still palpable. Is that supposed to make it better? Admitting you're selfish? Carmen looked at him then, and I saw her really see him for perhaps the first time. Not as a mark or a target, but as a person she'd genuinely hurt. No, it doesn't make it better. Nothing I say can make any of this better. I destroyed your life, James. I took 5 years from you and filled them with lies. I turned you against your mother, isolated you from your friends, stole from your business. She paused, her voice breaking. I made you into someone you're not, and I'm sorry doesn't even begin to cover that. Then why are you here? I asked. What do you want from us? Carmen was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. I want to tell you about the others. The other men, the other families. The prosecutor says if I cooperate fully, it might help some of them get their money back. Michael leaned forward. How many others? 17 over the past 8 years. Maybe more if you count the shorter relationships. Carmen's voice was clinical now, detached. There's a whole network. Women who share information, techniques, target lists. We helped each other. The scope of it was staggering. 17 families destroyed, 17 men manipulated and robbed, 17 sets of children and grandchildren who'd watched their loved ones disappear into relationships built on lies. James wasn't even supposed to be long-term, Carmen continued, and I saw him flinch. He was supposed to be a 6-month setup, get engaged, access his accounts, then disappear with a story about cold feet. What changed? Isabella asked. Carmen looked at me. Her. Ruth was supposed to be the easy part. Lonely widow, desperate for approval from her son's new girlfriend. Instead, she was watching everything I did, documenting it, waiting. I felt a grim satisfaction that my strategy had been effective, even though Carmen hadn't realized it at the time. She scared me, Carmen admitted. Ruth was too smart, too observant. I knew if I tried my usual quick exit, she'd figure out what I'd done and come after me. So I stayed longer, tried to neutralize her influence over James. By humiliating her, James said, his voice hard. By showing her that I had the power in the relationship, that she could be dismissed whenever I chose. Carmen looked at me again. I thought if I broke you publicly, you'd retreat completely. Leave me alone to finish what I'd started. Instead, you gave me the motivation to stop protecting you, I said. Carmen nodded. I underestimated you. All of you. I thought James was weak because he was kind. I thought Isabella would never find me. I thought you were just a bitter old woman who could be pushed around. She paused. I was wrong about everything. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Carmen provided names, dates, locations, and methods. She detailed how the network operated, how they shared information and resources, how they covered for each other when things went wrong. But more than that, she gave Isabella something I hadn't expected. Not an apology. Those were just words. But acknowledgement. She admitted that abandoning Isabella had been the worst thing she'd ever done. Worse than all the lies and theft and manipulation that followed. You deserved a mother, she told Isabella. You deserved someone who would stay and fight for you, instead of running away when things got complicated. I failed you in every way a parent can fail a child, Isabella cried then. Not from sadness, but from relief, the validation she'd needed for 15 years, the confirmation that her abandonment had been about Carmen's failures, not Isabella's worth as a person. When we left the jail, Isabella was quiet for a long time. Finally, as we sat in my car in the parking lot, she spoke. I thought I'd feel differently. Seeing her like that, hearing her admit everything, I thought I'd feel satisfied or vindicated or something. How do you feel? I asked. Free, she said simply. For the first time in my life, I feel completely free of her. James reached over from the back seat and squeezed his sister's shoulder. We both are. That Sunday dinner became our new tradition. Every week, Isabella and James would come over, and we'd cook together and talk about everything except Carmen. We'd learned to be a family without her, maybe a better family than we'd ever been with her. James had rebuilt his business honestly, with Isabella's help and my financial backing. He'd also started seeing a therapist to process the manipulation he'd endured, and to learn how to trust his own judgment again. Isabella's nonprofit was thriving, helping dozens of young people transition out of foster care with the support she'd never had. She'd also started dating a kind man named David, who worked at the children's hospital and understood her passion for helping others. As for me, I'd learned something valuable about the power of patience and strategic thinking. For years, I'd thought my only choices were to accept Carmen's treatment or to create a dramatic confrontation that would force James to choose between us. Instead, I'd found a third option. I'd waited for Carmen to reveal her true nature, documented everything, and then used her own cruelty against her. Not for revenge, though I'd be lying if I said that wasn't part of it, but for justice. Carmen had thought she could erase me from my son's life, make me irrelevant and powerless. Instead, she'd given me the motivation to become more powerful than I'd ever been. The pixie haircut had grown out some, but I'd kept it short. Sandra was right. It did make me look fierce. More importantly, it reminded me every day that I was stronger than people assumed, that I could survive anything thrown at me, and that sometimes the best revenge was simply refusing to disappear. Last week, I'd received a letter from one of Carmen's other victims, an elderly man in Florida whose life savings had been stolen. He'd written to thank me for exposing her, for stopping her before she could hurt anyone else. You saved my son from going through what I did, he'd written. You're a hero to families you'll never meet. I wasn't a hero. I was just a mother who'd been pushed too far and had finally decided to push back. But if protecting my family made me a hero to someone else's family, I could live with that. Carmen had been wrong about one thing. I hadn't been planning revenge for 5 years. I'd been planning protection. The revenge was just a bonus. That night, as I cleaned up after dinner and listened to James and Isabella planning their next weekend adventure, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Frank died. Complete contentment. My hair was shorter, my family was smaller but stronger, and the woman who'd tried to destroy us was exactly where she belonged. Not because I'd put her there, but because she'd put herself there through choices she'd made freely. Some people called what I'd done to Carmen vindictive. Others called it justice. I called it necessary. Because sometimes, the only way to stop a predator is to show them what it feels like to be prey. And sometimes, the only way to protect the people you love is to be willing to become someone they might not recognize. Carmen had wanted to teach me about power. Instead, I'd taught her about consequences. And in the end, that education had set us all free.